Hi, everybody. It is Dr. Zatani, AP European History. We're going to do chapters 17 and 18 together because they fit quite well together, and we're able to do that. So, we're going to start with a discussion of the economy and how agrarian work worked. The first thing that we're going to talk a little bit about because we are here in the 1700s and we're moving into the Industrial Revolution. However, before we get there, we have to talk about the Agricultural Revolution. And that starts with a number of the topics that we're going to be talking about here. So the first is the cottage industry, and it's exactly what you probably think it is. A family lives in an agrarian area, they have a farm, they have animals, they have crops. But as a side hustle, they also take the wool that they create from their sheeps, that they get from their sheeps, they card it, they spin it into thread, and then that thread is woven into cloth. And they do this within their home. And you see the dad here on the loom, the mom with the spinning wheel, the daughter carding the wool. They have the sheep, they create this wool, they create the cloth, they sell the cloth at the market, they profit from it. That is what the cottage industry is. And it's part of what is called the traditional economy. This is the economy that has been in place for thousands of years, right? Whether you're in a feudal system or serfs, this is an agrarian system. There are people who are working on farms. They probably don't own the land. In most situations, they do not. But their lives are dominated by agriculture. They are not moving to large cities. They're not traveling around a lot. Their days are consumed with manual work. And in the traditional economy, there is cottage industry. There's a little bit of overseas trade, right? We understand that mercantilism is, really taking, working with early modern Europe within this system. The big thing is that in this traditional economy, there's not a lot of change because experimentation is risky. If you change the way that you grow crops, you risk not growing enough and therefore people dying. However, as we know with the scientific revolution, and we know with this time of change, change is inevitable. And we call this the agricultural revolution. Now, this is sort of in a way, if you remember back from world history, there's also the Neolithic Revolution, which is the advent of agriculture. We are not talking about the advent of agriculture here. We are talking about Europeans developing new agricultural techniques. So within that traditional economy, what was in the past within the traditional economy before the agricultural revolution, it's marked by what's called the open field system. And you see a map here of the open field system. This was an agricultural pattern since the Middle Ages. Fields are in long, narrow strips. There's no fences, no hedges, no clear delineation as to whose field is whose. And there's some crop rotation that's happening because that changes the soil, and it's a good practice to follow, but it's not as scientific. It's really just a general practice. There's also open pastures, right? So there's commons, for example. Common, you'll see there, if you look on the right side here, this little bit here is the common pasture. This is where everybody in the village would graze their animals, their sheep, their goats, their cows. And that was a fairly common thing to have. Most towns had a common, and this was a common green. If you travel up to New England and you see the greens in the middle of towns in New England, or you go to the Boston Common, that's actually what that used to be in that time period in the United States. So this was something that early Americans practiced as well. For Europeans, these open lands, right, also included the woods, right, any forests where they would find roots and berries and collect firewood. And of course, in this open field system, right, the ideas of who had control over the land differed in different parts of Europe. In Eastern Europe, peasants tended to be much more exploited under a serf system. And in Western Europe, some peasants could own the land and could pass it down to their children. So I mentioned a little bit about crop rotation as something that is common in that traditional economy, but also something that sort of becomes a lot more cemented in the agricultural revolution. So way to think about this is sort of like, imagine there's three fields. Here's a field of wheat. Here, this is a fallow field where animals will graze, right? And then this is where barley is, right? And so you would rotate these year by year, right? So the animals are going to graze here in years 2, they're going to graze here in year 3, and then they're going to come back here in year 4. During the agricultural revolution, though, a lot of things changed for villages and farms. The biggest thing were called enclosures, and these are just fences, right? So people started putting fences up around their fields to delineate, this is the field that I'm working on, and that's the field that you're working on. And one of the reasons for this was that there was experimentation, right? So if the farmer down the street from you is experimenting and using a technique that you don't agree with, you certainly would want to have some sort of enclosure so that you would be clear that, hey, I'm using the traditional methods, you're using the new methods, right? Your risk is for your family. Like I'm not going to risk my family's well-being with the new techniques that you are trying out. So, excuse me as I let my dog out. So the other things that they experimented with in the agricultural revolution were using more fodder crops, planting things like clover that would replace the nitrogen into the soil, more crop rotation and kind of mindful crop rotation, selective breeding of animals, right? So deciding which traits of animals that they wanted to cultivate, and then using new tools like the one that you see here. This is a seed drill in this illustration. Socially, the cottage industry was still in place during the agricultural revolution, but then there's a newer sort of version of the cottage industry that's called the putting out system, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So let's talk first about enclosures. So within the agricultural revolution, you have enclosures. So the map on the left is farming with common areas. And then the map on the right shows farming in the same area, right, with enclosures. And you can see where the fences are drawn in. And the enclosure movement, advocates for change had to have approval from all landlords in the village. So, in order to build these fences, everybody had to agree on it. The need to enclose their holdings into compact fenced-in fields was sort of the motivation behind it. And everyone sort of got their individual share, right? And if you look at this map, you see that from 1700 to 1850, right, there's not enclosures everywhere, right? If the lion's share of the map is yellow, and that's under 1%, right? But in the dark red areas are where the enclosures were most prominent. The downside was that it was hard for people with small or no land. It eliminated those common areas, right? So people really had to sort of try to be economical with their space and to farm. That's a really hard thing to do. And those peasants lost traditional rights to grazing lands and to forests. And so with the sort of reduction in land that came with the enclosure movement, then as peasant families grew, the land then had to support more and more people. And this is then going to lead towards more urbanization for peasants in Europe. Landlords, of course, also thought enclosures were risky because in the traditional economy, you didn't change things. If things worked, then you didn't change them. And enclosures are generally a British thing, but also Belgium and the Netherlands, they used enclosures as well. Now, I mentioned a new system along with the cottage industry in the agricultural revolution is the putting out system. And it's sort of a cottage industry, but with a middleman. Right? So notice this grown cotton, right, comes via a merchant into peasant cottages, right? Spinners' cottages, weavers' cottages, right? And then the merchant goes and takes that finished cloth, sells it in town, and brings back some of the proceeds. And the spinners and the weavers would then get a percentage of the proceeds. So the family doesn't have full control over the means of production anymore in the putting out system. But with a much with the enclosures and with villages growing and there being more people on the land, the putting out system became one way for people to make extra money. I'd mentioned fodder crops as well. This is a picture of what clover looks like. Clover sometimes is purple. It's called crimson clover, right? And then there's like white clover as well. It smells very good. It's actually edible, and cows eat it. It's pretty prominent if you ever drive through Georgia. You tend to see a lot of clover fields. But this is a plant that, puts a lot of nitrogen into the soil. Likewise, animals, when they are grazing, right, they also will poo on the soil, and that gives nitrogen into the soil as well. So this leads us to what we want to call the industrious revolution, right? So we have things like the cottage industry. We have things like the putting out system. In Northwestern Europe, people were working more, right? There's less leisure time. Women and children are part of the wage earners, being wage earners in rural families. And likewise, with the rise of urban environments, more women are working for wages there as well. This leads to people who can buy more purchased goods. Women as buyers meant that more household goods and textiles could be purchased. And mercantilism is really helping with this whole system. And within the Industrious Revolution, right, here we see the gender division of labor. In general, you can kind of see what types of jobs there were for girls and women versus for boys and men. We will stop here. In our next video, we will talk a little bit more about urbanization and some of the social changes that come with that. Thank you.